Imelda, you're on mute.
Good morning. Welcome to the 10th meeting of the Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building, ACDEB. Thanks for joining us today. We're happy to be back together again after the June meeting was canceled for Juneteenth holiday. Today, I'll start with a recap of our progress since the May meeting. Then, we'll continue discussing the vision of the National Secure Data Service. We'll hear reports from two of our focus areas and gather feedback on two items, the committee's decision-making standards and a possible framework for choosing case studies. Progress since the May meeting. We've kicked off subcommittees for the 5 focus areas: legislation and regulations, including forthcoming OMB guidance and Evidence Act implementation items; governance, transparency, and accountability; technical structure; government data for evidence building; and other services and capacity building opportunities. In addition to those 5 focus areas, we've established a coordinating committee to synthesize feedback across focus areas and to minimize duplication of efforts. Thank you so very much to the subcommittee chairs and co-chairs and the coordinating committee. Just keep in mind that your leadership is extremely important to move these efforts forward. We've also started developing a project inventory to help us keep relevant information and work that we're doing available to guide our next steps. If you haven't yet submitted your project ideas, there will be time at the end of this meeting to provide suggestions, and you can continue to pass them along to the support team offline. I'd like to remind everyone of a couple of big concepts that have emerged from the committee's discussions. First, this is an iterative process. From top down, bottom up, and side to side, communication is flowing in all ways, and that is a good thing. Our discussions and around vision development provide a good example of how this could work. We're taking a multi-pronged approach to crafting NSDS vision with opportunities from input from individual members on the focus areas, the coordinating committee, and then we're going to also have opportunities for input from the full committee. We expect the full vision and related work plan and report outlines will emerge over time through this iterative process. Second, the second big concept is we can make incremental progress along multiple tracks at the same time. For instance, we're simultaneously working on developing the overarching vision and exploring questions that fall under specific focus areas. Speaking of progress, I'd like to give you an update on the federal budget as it relates to our work. You may recall that the FY20 and FY21 budgets provided explicit funding for federal data service projects at the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The House Appropriations Bill for FY22 includes several changes related to this funding stream, including consolidating this work under the Office of the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the Department of Commerce and possible funding cuts. While this is only the mark coming out of the House, it gives us an idea of where things may be heading. How will we see the comparisons to the Senate bill? That's what we're waiting for, to see how it compares to the Senate bill and the final appropriations. My question that I know that you're probably asking is, what does this mean for our committee? First, we're working with Census and BEA to identify recent and ongoing projects to feature in the project inventory. It's important to get a baseline of what's already been funded and think about how we can build on that as part of our discussion on next steps. We should also continue to monitor budget items related to NSDS, like this and the NSF reauthorization bill. This will help shape our recommendations with an eye toward future funding decisions as appropriate and feasible. Just for example, if a pilot project is to be implemented in the future, it most likely needs to be recommended and included in the budget for the previous year. And there are specific schedules that must be met to do this. Now I just want to turn to today's agenda. Pretty excited about what we're going to talk about today. The coordinating committee will start with the session to help us focus on the NSCS vision. Then we'll have readouts from two of the subcommittees, legislation and regulations, and government data for evidence building. Co-chairs from these teams will provide overviews of their initial discussions and pose a few questions to the committee. We'll close things out with a session on decision-making standards. The coordinating committee will introduce some general guidelines, and then I'll present a case study criteria matrix and walk through an example of how we could use it to screen projects. Throughout our discussions, it's important to keep in mind that the vision, describing what we're building, and our decision-making standards, deciding how to do it, go hand in hand with the efforts on the focus areas to shape our work plan and ultimately to drive our recommendations in the year 1 and year 2 reports. Before we start our discussion and hear more about the vision, our designated federal officer, Elisa Holdren, will provide a few reminders and general housekeeping items for the meeting today. Elisa?
Thanks, Imelda. So today I'm going to hit on a couple items around the theme of transparency. So by design, you'll recall that this committee is chartered to include a very diverse group of experts from around the private and public sectors. And we recognize that you all have a vested interest in the outcomes here. As with any federal advisory committee, there were a few legal requirements put in place before the committee launched that help us ensure transparency and avoid conflicts of interest. And these are things like you signed ethics statements and there were financial disclosures. In addition, the support team met with each of you to cast the vision for the committee and ensure that you could participate in this process openly and fully. So as we move forward, members should remain transparent about your outside interests and activities that may influence the committee's decision-making processes. So using the project inventory to flag your involvement in relevant work to the committee's efforts is one way that you can support transparency. In addition, when you participate at outside conferences and events, please be clear that you are not engaging in these activities in your capacity as committee members and that your opinions do not represent the views of the committee. In addition, me as the DFO and or Assistant DFO Megan Tiding will be attending all subcommittee meetings to help ensure that we maintain the high ethical standard that was established from the outset of the committee. If you have any questions or concerns on transparency, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or another member of the support team. I have one item on the support side that we are happy to let you know about. We've been working to revamp the OMB MAC site, and this site will serve as our system of record for subcommittee materials. So you'll be able to go there and see rosters and meeting minutes and draft reports. The support team will be responsible for gathering those relevant materials from any platforms such as Google Docs that the subcommittees are using and posting them to the site. And then everyone on the committee will have access once everything's been uploaded. In the email that went out a couple days ago, there were some tips and tricks for OMB MAC, but if you're still having problems accessing it, let me or Gianna Marone let us know and we can help out. So, on to the housekeeping for the meeting specifically. So, to reiterate our past ground rule on the use of the chat box, if you have something to say, please send a chat to everyone, and you can also include a 1 to 2 sentence description of what you'd like to talk about. And then we'll call on you to make a comment in the order of the chat received. You can also send other questions or comments to evidence@bea.gov. To other folks who aren't members, who are in our audience, thank you for joining us. Please use your chat function to raise questions or comments, and your questions will go directly to our host, who will pass them along and will address them as time allows. Even if we don't address all the comments in the meeting, everything, including feedback sent to our email box, will be shared with the committee. In addition, the support team does prepare an edited version of the chat that is available upon request. With that, I will send things back over to Imelda.
So thank you so very much, Alyssa. That was some very important information. And I just want to take a moment to piggyback on Alyssa's comments on transparency with a few thoughts on equity, since I believe the two things go together. Keep in mind that the makeup of the committee and our subcommittees was designed to pull a wide range of expertise and experience with a balance of voices from all levels of government and the private sector, including the privacy community. To be successful, we must blend those voices together to deliver timely, actionable recommendations that will have a significant and lasting impact. I strongly encourage all of you to engage fully in the discussions of your subcommittees. And please let me or the support team know if there's anything that we can do to support your participation. And with that, I believe we're ready to start the first session. I'd like to turn now to our first session on the NSDS vision. Committee members Nick Hart from the Data Foundation and Anna Hu of the Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations will outline some of the key issues on this topic and present a few items for the committee's discussion.
All right. Well, thank you, Imelda. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Hu, and along with Nick Hart, we're going to talk a little bit about the coordinating committee's conversation. There was a lot of discussion in the last meeting that we had about what the coordinating committee needed to do and help and structure that. And so this is, an opportunity for us to kind of talk through and react to what the initial conversation's been like and what we framed up for the committee the overall broad committee to react to. And that's really why the slides aren't a lot, but it's really meant to have you think about where we originally landed, and it's not necessarily something to formally push forward in a sense, but again, it's meant to give you some points to react to, because we could go. The discussion was so broad and covered so many different topics. We know that, again, as Imelda has indicated, we have so many diverse perspectives and backgrounds that we bring to this conversation. And again, we thought that having a few succinct points to react to was important for the committee to focus and think through in terms of next steps. So we'll go to that first slide and talk about that kickoff discussion we had. And overall here, again, the conversation was very broad. We covered a lot of different topics. But one of the key things we honed down pretty early on in the conversation was the fact that we were building on the Evidence Commission's work and the recommendations that the Commission had put forward, right? And so the NSDS was very much a product of, or a principle that was highlighted by the Commission to establish a basic framework for support. And additional guidance and design principles really needed to be fleshed out with the integration of both state and local government support. That's something that's been very consistent as well during our ACDEB conversations too. And so that, again, was a point we wanted to highlight here. The data service, again, we talked about, is it a place, principle, or a service? And, it's really a concept that's meant to supplement rather than, replace anything that is, or displace actually, what might already exist in the current ecosystem. And that we know that a single service couldn't be an end-all be-all for everyone, right? And different resources that already exist in the ecosystem are probably at different levels of development as well. And so, again, It really is something that we think is more of a collaboration and could lead to some type of federated or collaborative model to establish NSDS. And so we honed in on, again, 6 different areas which are meant to start the conversation off, but we wanted to highlight them here in terms of leadership, transparency, integration, innovation, and then technical support and intergovernmental cooperation. Before we jump to the questions, I don't know, Nick, do you want to kind of discuss some of those details in terms of these activities?
Yeah, well, thanks for the great overview. I might especially highlight the 4th bullet on this slide, just since I know this has been a topic that many have discussed bilaterally with each other, and it's come up in some of the other committees as well. And I cannot remember who offered this concept initially of the principal, place, or service, but I mean, truly, the way the Evidence Commission presented the data service, it was kind of envisioned as this entity. And if we take a step back and look at where we are in the current environment and the needs that have come up in the course of the discussions of this committee, it does suggest continuously that there are a lot of different ways to skin the cat here. And I think I want to encourage the committee to be open to the variety of solutions, including how those solutions can work together as we're talking about building the service. The other thing that I might suggest here is that as we've laid out what's on this slide, it strikes me that it's fairly consistent with some of the things, Imelda, that you mentioned at the top of today's meeting, including the NSDS Act, which has already passed the House, and some of the other discussions that are already underway with pilots and other activities across government. So for the activities specifically, this is an area where definitely welcome and encourage feedback from the committee because there are likely other priorities that should be here or could be here that we should talk about. Leadership, obviously an area that we would argue is maybe sorely missing in some ways across government for these data linkage activities today. Not surprising for me that the fact that there hasn't been a chief statistician in a year and a half, I think is also hugely problematic. Data service doesn't solve that, but that does suggest that there are some other things that are in the ecosystem that we should also be talking about that certainly relate to how this vision is actually implemented. There have been lots of discussions about privacy-preserving technologies, including some legislation that's actively under discussion on Capitol Hill. And I would also encourage that that's a great this could be a great framework for privacy-preserving technologies to not be necessarily mandated, but explored for further adoption so we can determine how and where they make the most sense for improving privacy protections in a real way. And then just finally, I'll highlight the intergovernmental cooperation piece. And I'm not the one from the state. I tend to work at the federal level. But so much of the data that we're using at the federal level is collected by state and local entities. This was not a headline topic of the Evidence Commission. So again, even though that first bullet says we're largely adopting the Evidence Commission's framework here or building on it, adding this element about state and local data is, I think, a must as we think about where the vision is for making this practical and useful going forward. So those are my handful of just quick additions, and then I think maybe let's turn to the questions so we can have some discussion.
Absolutely. So thank you, Nick and Anna. I'll now open up the floor for discussion. I just want to remind everyone again to limit the use of the chat function to indicate you have a question or comment, and then to give a brief description.
So Imelda, right now it looks like the only comment and question we have is Barry, who just reminded or suggested that each committee presenting could remind the group of its mission just as part of its presentation. And then our next question, we have a question from Julia. So Julia, we'll go over to you.
Sorry, every system has its own unmute button, so when you'd be dealing with 5 of these at a time, it's hard to remember. So, Nick and Anna, we had a discussion in the Governance and Transparency Committee meeting, and we thought it might be best to bubble it up in today's meeting. there is, you talk about a networked or a approach or a federated approach. So should we, it's hard to think about setting up governance if you don't know what the entity is that we're considering. So let me kind of push the question. In the paper that, or the position paper that has been circulating, you talk about an FFRDC. And you thought about that as being kind of an integral and important part of the federal statistical system, where it was kind of managed by a federal statistical agency that would represent it at the ICSP. And you thought about that as having SIPC protections and so on. But the advantage was, there were a couple of advantages, to be able to hire and attract high quality staff because you're outside the federal pay system, and also have a board of trustees as a reporting entity. So that separation, you kind of have these two different things. Inside the federal system as a federal agency, which is what the Commission recommends, and then what you talk about is an FFRDC, which would have a different remit and a different set of scopes. So what I'd like to hear from you, and maybe kick off the discussion, is where should we sit? Because it's going to be very hard to move forward without having a sense of what that looks like. And just one last point. The Board of Trustees in an FFRDC, of course, has the advantage of having the voice of underrepresented communities and having a vehicle that is more compelling maybe for outside users. So anyway, that was a long question, but I want to get your sense on that and to get that conversation as started.
So I think that's directed at me, and maybe
yes, it was.
And would welcome others' reactions too. So, not surprisingly, I presented the paper back in April that did have this recommendation of an FFRDC, including because of the value of the public-private partnership model. So I would argue it's a misnomer to say that FFRDCs are not, part of government, because actually part of the design is that it is linked to government with very strong governmental oversight. So practically speaking, there is likely, and this is sort of where the coordinating committee was, that there's some combination of activities that we should be really talking about, including maybe there's some component of this that actually does sit exclusively in government, and then maybe there's a component that works in parallel that is an FFRDC. There's no reason that as we as a committee develop our recommendations about the next step that we can't consider both things at the same time and actually recommend both things at the same time. As far as I know, we're not constrained about resources in our recommendations, but these are also not necessarily billion-dollar activities. I mean, we're talking about things that are in the tens of millions of dollars potentially as a starting point. So, there's an argument to be made here that maybe we should be doing multiple things at once because government is so incredibly far behind in its capabilities. And if we put all of our eggs in one basket, that might be too limiting for catching up for where we should have been 20 years ago. So, while I had that recommendation and Nancy Potok had that recommendation in the paper that we presented previously, I again think there's a case here to be made that we should be exploring multiple models simultaneously that are working in tandem, working in coordination.
That's extremely helpful. That helps the governance committee, I think, a lot. So essentially, describe what a governance system might look like for either or both.
And I would just one addition to say they have to be coordinated, right? Like these things can't happen in silos because that's also a part of the problem that we're actually trying to solve for, I hope.
Thank you both so much. So next we'll go over to Christina.
Hi, all. Thanks. This is very interesting. My question is really dovetails on top of Julia's from the standpoint that rather than sort of thinking about these like sort of end states in terms of here is the kind of program that we're looking towards, I was thinking about this in terms of like minimum requirements, is we're thinking about how we embed explicitly innovation into this, rather than, I think, throwing out there this idea of like, okay, FFRDC is this one model that we're going towards, instead of saying, well, here's the requirements we're looking for. This is an alternative to meet those requirements. But I know in our technology subcommittee, we're talking about where could we look to for, sort of future innovations and how contracting is done in a way that perhaps we could embed some security principles in these arrangements that doesn't necessarily require like known solution sets, but that we may be able to borrow from, some other existing relationships that, this particular committee isn't necessarily itself using. So I feel like I would also recommend too that we think about this in terms of, what are some minimum requirements or minimum functionalities that we're looking towards, and identifying those priorities, and then we can, I think, sort of explicitly put in this piece and encourage some thoughts outside of just the traditional frameworks. So not really a question, but just a comment.
Oh, thank you so much. We'll go over to Matt next. I see you have a question.
Thanks. So my question is a tad more pedestrian, but I still want to see if I can get the wisdom of the group. So I co-lead our capacity building and other services subcommittee. And so I noted on a prior slide the leadership and leadership communications point. The subcommittee did have a question as to whether communications might be an important function it could help support. But I don't think that our group would necessarily be the generator or decider of what the leadership messaging ought to be related to all of this work. So I'm curious to hear from folks. Nick, you mentioned the absence of a chief statistician. Do we have a sense as to who might be able to help lead up that work? We're glad to support communication efforts and talk about the value proposition, but we would certainly love to know who might be the kind of leadership group that helps shape the initial content.
So Nick or Anna, did you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Is the question that, sorry, I missed it. Is the question about the content of the committee's work, or are you focused more broadly on kind of all of the pieces of the ecosystem?
No, so if an important component of this work is making sure folks are aware writ large of the value and benefits of this and the opportunities the NSDS provides folks to all levels of the system and all communities. We think the subcommittee may be placed to help handle the logistics of those communications, but perhaps not the kind of initial creator of the content or decided what the messaging ought to be. Where should that leadership come from, Nick, in terms of describing the benefits and values of an NSDS? Or do you feel like the content already exists and we just need to be more clear with folks about what the benefits are?
I would suggest that a lot of the content does exist, and we probably could always be clearer. It's a general statement I make about government. But truly, like this was a committee that was actually assigned in law to the chief statistician of the United States, and the fact that the position is still vacant and a permanent capacity is a travesty. We need that role for a lot of reasons, and I know there's a lot of representatives of the statistical system on this committee that could probably also echo that, as they've likely felt the consequences of that gap of leadership. And it's not to say that the people in acting capacities are not doing a great job, but having a permanently assigned chief statistician was literally part of the vision of how the Evidence Act would be implemented, how SIPC would be implemented. It's got components of the Paperwork Reduction Act tied to it. We need that role filled, and it's incumbent on OMB to prioritize that, given the context that we're in the modern world, using data and the administration's commitments to prioritizing data and evidence-based policymaking. So I don't know how this committee might lean in on that point, but it seems like that's the logical place to start. And then, maybe there are other ideas from.
Yeah, I would also say that, we as committee members definitely do have a role in helping to shape not only that particular issue and support that, but also we interact with so many different groups, and, the value proposition shifts, right, with the different audience and how they interact. I mean, from like my own perspective, we deal with direct members of the public every day, and to help them understand when we're getting direct claim information from them, how it might be used and why it might be valuable to do that. But that's also helping to train our own teams and staff to understand the value of their work as well, and their role in that bigger data scheme as well, right? Because we're going to be utilizing the data that they're also going to be collecting for that. So it is that broader public conversation too, to help folks understand how is data being used in their own day-to-day lives, and it is constantly changing. And frankly, on the communication scheme, while we do have some known means of technology and avenues to communicate now, those will continue to shift as well. And so, how do we establish and maybe network in a way that allows for a degree of flexibility, because we know the technology will continue to evolve, but we know human nature overall, and the relationships that we build will probably last much longer than the technology itself. So again, can we establish a better coalition or network of individuals who will be, the army of the willing, right, to continue to be consistent on the messaging and help with pushing that as well.
Thank you so much, Nick and Anna, and thank you, Matt. That was a great point and a great question. It looks like next, Amy had a comment or question about competing priorities under the system that, Nick, you were mentioning, and how you might resolve competing priorities. So, Amy, do you mind just expanding a little bit more on your comment?
Sure. I wasn't sure if I was understanding completely. I know that this is all still very, very much information, but what was described sounded like a solution that was going to have defined silos. If you're saying there are these multiple places that are going to be charged with proceeding to do this, and I would anticipate competition for resources and also a lot of conflict over what top priorities are. And I just can't stop but think that to resolve those conflicts that would arise about who gets to do what pilot or what pile of money goes where, you need some ultimate authority. You need somebody that the buck stops with. And if our group if Julia's group especially is going to proceed with this dual track, I just wanted to throw in that it seems like you need something where there is the driver of the entire thing.
So I don't think from the coordinating committee's discussions, anyone would disagree that there needs to be some basic coordination structure. I might add, Amy, like your concern here is a very real one. It's also the state of the world that exists today, where everyone's competing for resources. There are lots of silos, lack of coordination, under coordination even. And so I think we want to keep in mind as we're building out this vision that we're trying to create a net improvement, and we may not find a panacea or a way to solve everyone's problems, but we do want to make sure that we are improving upon rather than making things more complicated. Maybe, there are lots of suggestions that we could build in here about, we just talked about the chief statistician role, for example. Perhaps that role should have some capacity explicitly in law or expectation even about how priorities are set, resources are allocated. And, this is an area that maybe we can talk about in some of the other subcommittees about how you might build up that function. So if you have this disaggregated, decentralized statistical system, you're adding these other pieces on top or in parallel with it, that the system still continues to function in an ideal state. And again, we're not making it worse. But yeah, the resources I think are always going to be an issue, just as a very practical matter. And, OMB just put out a memo 2 weeks ago, M2127. It was primarily about evaluation, but it explicitly says you must allocate resources across the federal government for the evidence building function. Well, OMB should probably do that for itself too. And I think this committee has a role to continue echoing that resource point, Amy. So I think that's a great suggestion.
And to piggyback on that, Ken, you have a comment or a question about making a recommendation for the chief statistician position. Do you want to expand on that just a little bit?
I mean, basically, I guess my comment was simply, why don't we can surely make that a recommendation in our report that you need to do this and you need to do it now, and maybe even you need to upgrade it, that position to better match what the recommendations coming out of the Evidence-Based Policy Commission.
So Megan, I'm going to jump.
No, please, go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm going to jump in here. I've been trying to wait for a good moment. So I agree wholeheartedly. I think no one more than me, I'm going to be a little selfish here and say no one more than me looks forward to the appointment of a chief stat of the U.S. I'd like to iterate, though, that I am in constant communication with OMB and with Dom. And I know that this is a top priority for him and the administration. I'm also very encouraged by conversations with the Office of Science and Technology Policy and other players, I think, in this space. I'd say yes, let's be very clear about what our needs are for that chief stat position and where we think we need to fill some voids. One area that I have emphasized, regardless of what position or what hat I might be wearing, is the need for communication strategies around communicating the value. Now that we have a platform for a discussion of data and the value and need for data, this whole idea of how do we communicate it is very important. And I look forward to hearing more, excuse me, from the committee in terms of what those strategies would look like. In addition, I think I might have cut Lynn off there a bit. I didn't get quite to his comment about the idea of where a communications shop would fall. But just wanted to say that in terms of where we are and how we're thinking about things, the communication with OMB is there. And I do believe that we're in a really solid place in terms of being able to move forward, although we have people acting in various capacities. And I appreciated Nick's pointing out that we are this decentralized system. And this is what excites me, honestly, about what we're doing as a committee, is it gives an opportunity to pull people together and to pull value systems together around data that haven't been there before. And so while that can be a challenge, I also think this is an excellent opportunity to start to make sure that we're all thinking about things in a similar way, regardless of whether it's facing those challenges of having several efforts as we try to define what an NSDS looks like. Surely the FSRDC is not the only option, as has been pointed out today. But what we're looking for are options that are going to really communicate the value of being able to use data in the way that we've been hearing from the Evidence Act itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imelda. So we have a couple comments. We have Ted and then Chris, both on the queue for comments. But before we go to them, there's been some back and forth between Lynn and Matt about the communication shop and the potential of adding this as an agenda item on the capacity building subcommittee's work for their upcoming meetings. Either Matt or Lynn, is there anything else that you want to add to this discussion about the communication shop or about resources for this communication effort before we pop on to the next topic?
I would just say we'll address it in our subcommittee and come back to the whole group to give you guys a full update.
I want to clarify that I was kind of responding to, I think, Anna's concern that we would adopt particular methods for communication that would turn out to be outdated and or not be able to adapt quickly. I think I completely agree with Matt that this is a key issue for the subcommittee to address.
Excellent. Thank you both. So then we'll go over to Ted next.
Good morning. I think I'm just going back a little bit to the back and forth with Nick and Amy a little bit with regard to kind of a centralized model and the decentralized system. I feel like all of those points are really valid. I think we do have a decentralized system. We may be asking the question about centralization at what level, right? And what are the levers? Where are the levers? Where are the best levers to make progress quickly? Can we make progress in multiple areas more quickly by using those levers. So where you have a CFO, CIO, multiple agencies, statistical agencies, can you make progress in capacity building? But I also agree with Amy that when it comes to really priority questions or priority issues, there has to be a governance process that enables that secure data service to leverage that underlying capacity. So maybe it's not a false choice, but it's more about centralization at what level and what are the levers. And I think the committee overall, part of the recommendations need to really think about what are those levers that are the drivers to help us to make that change. So that's all. I just enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. Chris, I see you have a comment about simplicity and a non-incremental approach. Looking over to you.
And one other. I'll amplify the comment about needing for a point person. There's conversations going on how actively on how to deal with this issue, the National Secure Data Service. For our group to have a voice, and for that matter, for Capitol Hill to know who's the go-to person from this committee. Certainly a chief economist or a point person for communication would help that. When there's got many leaders, sometimes that means there's no leader, and we're not really orchestrating communication. But then also when I look at the vision statements, it presents an image in front of me that is multifaceted and somewhat complex, which is the enemy. And incrementalism, I think, also is the enemy. We have a unique moment in time where we're being asked to recommend a solution. And I think we have to do that and not get into the typical federal little bit by little bit by little bit approach, but rather say, no, this is straightforward. This is easy to understand. This is easy to access. And this will vastly improve accessibility of information while protecting privacy. We can't move like a glacier when technology and research is moving like lightning. So I'm arguing for simplicity, and I'm arguing that we do need a point person at communicating.
Thank you so much for both of those. So right now we are caught up on all of the comments or questions in the chat section, Imelda. So unless there is anybody else on the committee who has additional comments or questions, I can turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I find the conversation very interesting also. So please feel free to reach out to the support team in terms of the types of conversations that you're talking about, Christine, where there's been a need for a point person and there hasn't been one. If it is as it relates to the committee, then probably should be doing that in this role until someone else is appointed. And I'm not aware of a need for that. And I don't know whether Dom might be aware as well. But I also wanted to say that keep some of this conversation that we're having now in mind, this balance of incremental progress versus being too slow if we think incremental. What we don't want to happen is that we have conversations that don't lead us to the progress that you described, Christine. I'll just say with some of those comments because you were the last person, maybe they're most salient. But progress is paramount in terms of being sure that we can seize where we are. This is an unusual place where everybody's talking about data and the value of data, and so we absolutely have to take advantage. Please keep this conversation and your points in mind as we think about the criteria moving forward, whether this idea of how do we ensure that we are creating a virtual system in spite of the decentralization of our government and our federal statistical system. How do we ensure that we're taking advantage of what's already in place in the statistical agencies as it relates to CIPC and privacy protection? So those would just be my encouragements to think about that, to think about those things when we start getting into the criteria that we set for ourselves as we move forward. I want to thank
Imelda, if I can jump in real quick, so Nick would like to pose a question to the group about next steps. And really quick before then, we have had some comments that have come in from attendees that are not on panelists, so we will be handling this offline and helping to get answers to those. So we wanted to make sure folks recognize that those are there, but we will certainly not, they are not being lost. We are capturing them and we'll handle them offline. But we can go to Nick about a question for next steps.
Yeah, so I guess having had this discussion now and several members of the full committee have put things on paper and shared, I'm wondering what the most effective next step for all of us might be, just so the coordinating committee can continue moving the ball forward. My instinct is to say the coordinating committee should move beyond just simply the slide deck here and really do a pen to paper where we sort of outline this vision with a lot more text to give to the full committee to react to. And I guess it'd be helpful to know if that's actually helpful or if folks would like to have some more small group discussions or dialogue before the coordinating committee takes that step. Just to get a quick pulse check of where the committee is would be really helpful in chat or verbally.
So we have a comment from Matt that a paper would definitely be helpful. I'm seeing nods from several committee members. Julia is saying a paper would be helpful. It sounds like that you have general agreement, Nick, that next steps, some sort of a paper would be helpful. Yes, Elizabeth is saying she's agreeing. Julia's mentioning that she'd like to get into specifics.
So I think I've just volunteered myself for this. So
Can I just...
Well, on the coordinating committee side, we will help, on the support staff side, we will help you in the coordinating committee pull that together. You are not alone, Nick, and the coordinating committee is not alone. We're not throwing you into the sharks on this.
I just want to, there's going to need to be a lot of writing in the coming months and a lot of threading pieces together. So our group is only just beginning to meet, and I just wanted to make it clear that the groups are not going to have to change their scope and ideas to fit into the earliest draft, that this is going to be something that needs to be woven together, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point, Amy, and yes, absolutely. We're not looking to change the scope of any of the existing focus groups areas. And we also understand that there will likely be a fair amount through the coordinating committee of alignment between the various focus areas and kind of fitting everything together. We're planning on that as part of the steps of developing the final report. And then Anna, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I guess following up on what Nick and Amy have already said, again, we want to be flexible and make sure that all of these different lines of efforts are coordinated at the end of the day, right? That it's not, the presentation that Nick and I put forward summarized a lot of the key points that we discussed in the group. But was there anything that was too far out of bounds or something that we just completely missed? I feel like maybe because we didn't read the questions out, but, we've gotten a lot of good feedback. But at the same time, I guess I'm hoping as we work on this next step with the paper, so Nick, you're not alone, that it's, that if there are certain things where it's like, well, this would be an area we definitely would like you to approach and fleshing out first, or that, we're missing something key, or we just plain don't understand or don't think this is something that needs to be included in the vision.
So any comments from committee members on if there's anything that has been missed or that they feel is out of bounds for this? Chris, I see you have a comment.
Sure, a simple one. Somebody used the expression basic requirements during discussion. I think that would be a great thing to see in the paper. What are the boundaries of this that we're going to recommend? What are those basic requirements that if we missed it, we missed the mark?
Great, thank you. And then I see comments from Barry about that we want to make sure that the subcommittees are shaping the vision, and Brian is agreeing with that and agreeing that perhaps organizing around key NSDS functions. So great points on both of those. And we'll go to Lynn. I see you have a comment.
This one, I'm not sure whether it belongs here or somewhere else, but one thing that occurred to me is when we have all of this material together, maybe we could commission a really good developmental editor who could turn it into something like a book that people would want to read. I think one of the problems with committee reports is that they can be kind of dense and technical. And I know you're going to be working on that, but we could try to make this more accessible than typical committee reports turn out to be.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that we, regardless of if it's a book or if it is just how we structure the report, to make sure that this is something that is accessible, not just to people who are intimately involved in this on the day-to-day, but to folks who are interested but perhaps not as involved from a technical standpoint, is a key aspect of it. And Anna's agreeing that the idea is definitely helpful for communication and messaging. Yes, so this ties back to our earlier comments about making sure, how do we message the value proposition to different groups? And part of that is making sure that whatever we're preparing is easily accessible to various groups at various levels of expertise. Other comments, questions? All right, then Imelda, I will turn it back over to you again with, it sounds like a good idea of next steps for the for developing out the vision.
Exactly. So I want to thank everyone for a very productive conversation today, and there are many takeaways. I think that Nick and Anna have what they need to get us started on the paper, and we also have an idea of a potential book in the making, so we can keep that at the forefront. The minimum requirements and what is the sandbox, so to speak, what is the framework, just to be clear, in terms of where do we go and what do our recommendations look like. Please keep that in mind as we go through the other discussions as well, and we're all working to tie those things together. For now, we can take our break early. And it is to be a 10-minute break. So I'm going to look at my clock at 9:53 and say, please be back at 10:03. Thanks again for a productive discussion, and we look forward to hearing from the legislation and regulations focus area. Talk with you soon. Hear me okay? I'm from the Department of Commerce, who will provide a report on the legislation and regulations focus area. Over to you.
Hi, this is Chris Heflin. I'm the co-chair of Legislation and Regulations according to with Nick Hart, and I'll be speaking, moving through the slides for both of us. Next slide, please. I'll start by a brief summary of what I understand our mission to be. It's basically to develop some recommendations around changes in law, rule, guidance from OMB that would facilitate the work of the National Secure Data Service while upholding all the privacy principles that are so sacred. So that's the job at hand. We had a meeting with a very far-ranging, wide-ranging conversation, but we did come out actually at a very similar place. I also participated in the group on data for evidence making, where case studies would be of great assistance in communicating what could be improved. I've been coached by Nick, I'm sure quite correctly, that the members of Congress who have to act to make this National Secure Data Service real clearly see the downside of any breach of privacy. Right? It's so topical. It's so problematic. We seem so vulnerable. Articulating the upside of having better access to data for research and evaluation needs to be well articulated so it can counter the very clear downside to breaches of privacy. And like many things, when you're communicating, a story is better than a generalization. We could do research faster, we could do research better, we could use our time better. But one thing, a story that clearly articulates delays that are necessary or rules that get in the way without an apparent benefit go a long way to helping our position beyond those generalizations. So we clearly want to see case studies, and ideally a case study that would include state government. I know from the participation of state representatives on this panel that states are shoulder to shoulder with the federal government, at least some are, in terms of the push for database decision-making and access to information necessary for research. So with those wonderful allies, if we could have some case studies that also speak to the advantages to the state government, the things they want to know about, that would also be a big plus in talking about what this National Secure Data Service could do and what some streamlining in the rules could do. So that's a big takeaway. A broad data sharing request to permit multiple analysis under one approval process. That point, I accidentally, serendipitously got amplified by a conversation with some folks from the Minority Business Development Administration of Commerce. And what they told me was they've had several economists in their organization get special sworn status at the Census Bureau. That special sworn status gives them access to microdata. And right now with equity, such a big topic, and equity being at the central core of the MBDA's, the Minority Business Development Administration's mission, that special sworn status is great, but they tell me really to use the data, they'll have to construct specific projects and have those projects approved through the formal approval system, and that they felt, I'm not sure this is quite accurate, any deviation from that path that they put out in the proposal would require yet another proposal. That brought up the topic or reinforced the thought that was discussed in our subcommittee that perhaps some of those proposals could be written differently, more broadly, that would let one experiment a bit with, as you're working with the data, you're getting ideas about other avenues you might want to pursue to support a point, that maybe there's some opportunities to model better and broader agreements on the use of the information that will permit wider reaching analysis. The other point, that's third point, comes very much from the Commission's report. They observe that states administer some federal programs, and the state's policies that give or don't give access to the data created by those federally funded programs differ. Some being quite open, others quite the opposite. And that perhaps we could work with our, again, our state allies here on the commission, on the advisory committee, to come up with some models saying, this is doing this, having this approach will facilitate research. Another point that came up by one member, but I thought was a point well taken, was that some of our research is done by contractors, and that there is a need in terms of, I don't know if it would be a rule, but certainly a standard practice, to put in contracts standard language about the maintenance of the data and how it can and can't be shared. Next slide, please. Have we got the next one yet? Okay, low-hanging fruit. All credit to Nick on this low-hanging fruit. But he observes, and I'm sure he's correct on this, that the original committee report or commission report offered that guidance from OMB would assist in sharing data. It observes, and I know correctly from being in bureaucracy for the better part of my life, that we have a conservative aspect towards most every ask we get. When in doubt, say no. You don't get in trouble for saying no, but that's some good guidance from OMB to push us very evenly and more consistently in the direction from the Evidence Act, which is open data by default. And so inviting OMB to put out some rules that would get us more so on the same page in terms of what data is available and when we can say yes and can say yes without fearing, tripping over a legal requirement. I'm a little less secure about the second point, that OMB perhaps could issue some guidance having to do with sharing of data that the states create in administering federal programs. Perhaps OMB has license there as well that could give us more consistent policy. So a lot of this is, what can we do right now without any additional rule or legislation changes by using the authority that's already been put there, and actually the direction that's already been put there for OMB to put out some guidance. Nick also observed that we have authorities, sharing authorities that perhaps we're not generally aware of, and that it would be advantageous to put together some materials on that, some easily accessible materials that shows authorities that permit us and support us sharing information. And then lastly, hardly an expert on the topic, but I know just within the Department of Commerce, we have scores of memorandums of understanding about sharing data. And every time I see a memorandum of understanding, I see a month of work from different people that it would be great if they were actually doing some research. Is there some way to have some standards around the memorandums of understanding to reduce the time to develop them, make them readily approved if they contain certain components? So those may be low-hanging fruit, and of course we'll have some discussion on that. Next slide, please. Okay, we've got the questions, and the first one very much goes to some of the points I just made. Can we accomplish a lot of what we want to accomplish through additional guidance and not necessarily have to go through the very complex process of revising rules and legislative change? So what can we do with what we already have is a very broad question. And some of those things I think were brought up on the previous slide, where OMB could put out some guidance that generally encourages us to be more open. So I should open the floor on that one before we move on for any discussion, and I'll be taking notes carefully. Any comments?
I want to just quickly helicopter in and say, Chris, thanks for presenting on the committee's behalf. So there are other members of the committee that I'm sure have some feedback and additions, but I do want to stress just for the entire committee that the purview of our subcommittee is intended to be about both laws and regulations. So it's explicitly identifying some areas that might require statutory change, as well as ways of better leveraging the existing law. So this is, of course, cross-cutting to everyone else's subcommittees on every possible topic. I'll just add, we are working on a list of ideas that have been floated, some of which Chris has just highlighted, but others that have come up throughout all of the discussions that we've had to sort of isolate where some targeted change, say in the tax code or some other particular authority might be relevant for future discussions. So hope to be able to share that with folks as a near-term next step and not too far down the road. And also be able to use that maybe as a straw man. So in the course of this discussion also, if there are things that folks are thinking about that you haven't floated yet, it'd be helpful to drop those in the chat or mention them just so we can make sure we're capturing everything. The last thing I'll say before we totally open the floor is there will inevitably be some discussion, particularly around the second bullet here, for OMB's capacity. It's come up in a couple of past meetings. I'm going to suggest that we not feel so bounded by OMB's capacity as we're brainstorming what is necessary to solve the problems that are in front of us, and take that as a kind of separate problem, that if there's all of these things that OMB should be doing, then we can also make a compelling case that, yes, they actually need more capacity. So we can take those sort of on a parallel track, but I don't think we should be bounded in our imagination by the capacity constraint as a starting point. So I just wanted to make sure that was on the table. So with that, the first question Chris threw up here was about, to what extent we might lean in on the legislative changes versus better using the administrative capabilities from Evidence Act and other authorities that are already in place. And I know there's lots of comments, so I'll defer to whoever is running the coordination for that part.
Thank you so much, both Chris and Nick. So we do have several folks who want to weigh in and make comments. So we'll start with Amy, and then we'll go to Ken, and then Lynn. So Amy, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for working on this. Just on the top line idea that legislative change is going to win the day, my experience with the one crystal clear relationship between Census and IRS, where it's in the tax code that they are to share data with the Bureau. So it's absolutely clear from that legislative standpoint. That still burdens staff at both staff and executives at both agencies to come up with annual data requests and MOUs, because even though the law says thou shall, there are regs that say you can use these data for these purposes, and then you need agreements on top of that. So just because you get legislative change doesn't mean that everything else is smooth sailing. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone on this that it isn't this silver bullet. I didn't hear anything. I know that you guys have been focusing on the big picture, but I urge you to consider some language suggestions for agency system of record notices, for their privacy impact assessments, because those are things that if you can get standardized about the way that identifiers are going to be used and how the data will be used for evidence building, getting that slotted into those as they all come up for renewal would be really critical. And then related, but not necessarily in those documents, coming up with standard language that the attorneys all will understand about what is a routine use. And I would consider here the way that there used to be data centers at all of the federal agencies, and then they started using cloud service providers. And that didn't need a change in the routine use. It was the technology through which the routine uses occurred. And I would urge you to consider privacy preserving technologies as something akin to cloud service providers in that regard, so that you're not opening a new can of worms and debating them, but you are saying this is how we get the work of government done. So the only other thing that I wanted to mention, and I know that I have a laundry list and I can put them in writing for you guys in the future, but figuring out how tiered access is going to work is another thing that I think is, a very, very high priority, because there are agencies that are reading their current statute as data are open or data are closed. And if data are closed, you must be one of our agents. You have to be an employee or a contractor to use those data. And some readings of existing statute don't have any gray space. It is either black or white. And so I think that it would be great if we could think through the language that could be proposed, ideally in something at the NSDS, so that you're not opening every single agency's statutes that would permit tiered access that would be a nod toward these modernization efforts in privacy protection. So get something that's in between open and closed. And Nick, I'm sure you're thinking, yeah, that's what the chief statistician should have done, but there's no one in that seat. I don't know if we have the luxury of waiting on that, because I think that there are a lot of agencies that just are digging in and saying, I can push out open data, but it's going to be highly perturbed, or you can become one of us. And then it feeds into what Chris was saying, because you're wearing these very tight constraints if you're a special sworn employee. So what is that middle ground for using encrypted data that you shouldn't need to have special sworn status, perhaps? So, thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And then we're going to go to Ken, Lynn, and then Julia. But very quickly before, Barry, I saw you had a follow-on comment to some of Amy's comments about some of the legality of data sharing between IRS and Census. So I just wanted to give you a chance to hop in there before we move on to the next set of comments.
Yeah, I think that Amy's comment about the ability of the IRS to share data from Title 26 with the Census Bureau was a little bit overgeneral. I think it does provide a challenge to this committee in that you should look carefully at the existing language in the statutes to see if any of it needs to be loosened. The law currently requires the regulations. It references the regulations directly, so they have to be propagated through the regulatory process, which makes it take 2 years if you want to make a change. And the law lays out explicit limits on how the Bureau can use the data to support its program. And so, you know, I'm sure it's not unique to the Title 26, Title 13 relationship. So if there are limits in these rules of these existing legislation that pose challenges, then we should perhaps be suggesting ways to loosen that if that's a goal of the committee. You know, while we're at it, while I have the floor, I just would like to say that I think we also need to look at the privacy laws. Right now, all the requirements, all requirements are on the government employees to do a good job of protecting the data, especially when we release data to the public. So you're talking about perturbing data. Part of the reason we have to go so far is because there's no penalty if someone has unlimited resources and time to break a data set and re-identify somebody in something we release. All the penalty is on the federal side. If there was more of a shared responsibility for protecting all data, including those that are released through research papers or through public use files or through tables, then I think we could relax some of these requirements and be a little less stringent. So I think we should look at that as well. I think it's a real opportunity for us to start to reshape the privacy responsibilities when we want to expand the use of data. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And it sounds like that Julia has a quick add-on comment between the tension between the census statute to use administrative records data to the most extent necessary and IRS sharing to the maximum extent. So Julia, is there anything else you wanted to add on about that particular?
Yeah, I do want to just agree with Barry. There is a process in place to, and it is in the regs. So if you want to get additional data added, there's a very clear list in the regs in 6103J that lists the information. Am I wrong on that, Barry?
You are correct that the regs list out the individual data items that the Bureau can get. You're incorrect in saying that there's a responsibility to maximize the use of IRS data. That's not the way 6103 is written.
No, the census statute is to use administrative data to the maximum extent necessary. But IRS is to share data to the minimum extent necessary. Am I not correct on that?
I would agree with Julia that Title 13 says the Bureau is to use all data sources to minimize burden and have the best data quality to achieve the mission of the agency. But I'm also incredibly familiar with Title 26, and it lists specifically the elements for specific programs that census can use. So it's, as Barry said, it's always a case that if you want to do the regs change, you can't have it that year. You've got at least 2 years until you could affect the regs to allow census to use more data.
And so that was where I wanted to follow up on that. There is a list in the regs and they can get changed, but it takes 2 years. And then even though the regs are very specific, when you get the regs change, it's very specific. So when we wrote the regs change for the addition of the W-2, 4 boxes on the W-2, that was specifically only for the use of the SIPs to improve linked employer-employee imputation. But since then, that use of the W-2 has gone way beyond the specific purpose that was used to justify the regs.
And just for everyone, Julia, SIP?
So their income.
Can you spell out SIP for us?
So their income and program participation.
Barry, if I may, Julia, it says that it is to be used by certain programs. Sometimes it has an example of the specific use, like you're saying, within that program. But my original comment was just because you have legislative change doesn't mean that you're on easy street.
Correct.
To Julia's point, and Barry, like to this particular discussion, there are teams of people from both Census and IRS that carefully inspect every request, and they're looking at the words in the regs to make sure that nobody is getting data out of bounds.
Correct.
But it takes not an army of people, but it takes a bunch of people to make sure that happens, and it's on a quarterly basis. So even with permissive legislation, there's a lot of this, and I don't know how you streamline that. Barry had some ideas.
All right, so let's go. So we do have several folks who have listed in the chat that they have a comment, and I want to make sure we get to them. So we will start out going to Ken. I think this is great discussion going back and forth.
So, you know, I think Barry, a couple of things. I think Barry made an important point, is the thinking about changing and having a discussion. I think we need to have a discussion of Title 26, Title 13, and SIPC to make sure we are balancing protection and value of research appropriately. And, you know, a lot of what the census is doing in terms of perturbing the data and imputing all of the data for, you know, the ACS, they call it synthetic. It's imputing everybody, everything, is somewhat in a reaction to the fact that, you know, the folks at Census are held responsible if someone can get, you know, identify someone in the data. And so they're taking that very seriously, as they should. They're not responsible for releasing data late so that we can do reapportionment. You know, that's not a criminal charge. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I would say also, I think the other thing that would be useful to keep in mind, it's not necessarily, you know, you put in a proposal that says you can only do these things with the data when you go in an FSRDC. All of these proposals, you can have my research is going to make everyone in the world better off by $1 trillion. But if it doesn't help Census collect data better, it doesn't get approved. Now, you know, yeah, Census has gotten good at, you know, and other agencies have gotten good about working through, it's got to benefit Census in its mission in some way, but boy, you know, should that be the overarching concern for research going into Census, is that somehow I have to tell some story that somehow my research has improved the collection of data at the Census. And I think if you look at the Census, the research that's gone on, you'd be hard pressed to find more than a handful of papers that anybody's ever done that has actually had a measurable impact on how Census collects their data. Maybe it's more than a handful, but I still think that would be something that it would be nice to get away from. And going back to the point before, a lot of these issues, my understanding is, you know, some of this is with the chief statistician in OMB has the ability to push people to share data, not through a regulatory process, but through an administrative process. And that gets back to the fact that we don't have a chief statistician, so that role is not being played. And even in the past, the chief statistician didn't have the resources that would enable them to play a more active role in helping agencies coordinate and getting over some of these issues. So, I mean, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. I will stop there.
Thank you so much. So we'll go to Lynn in just a second, but before we do, I saw that Ted, you had a comment on building on Barry and Ken's comments about the scope of discussion. So do you mind explaining a little bit more in depth about that?
I just wanted to encourage the direction of that conversation. It's interesting.
Oh, we can't. We're having trouble hearing you.
Is that better?
Oh, that's much better.
Okay, I'll just speak that way then. No, I was just going to encourage the discussion that's happening, and I'm interested from the subcommittee's perspective on how much they may dive into privacy laws, current conceptions, trade-offs. I know Nick had a comment, but maybe someone wants to comment on that, but just wanted to encourage the dialogue on that.
Megan, if I could jump in for just a second here too. So this has been great conversation so far. There was a little bit of a discussion on census reviews of proposals and how that's going. I want to ensure us that we're not saying that census has somehow done something wrong there. I'm not sure where that comment was, but let's just make sure we're clear there. The other thing is that keep in mind the presumption of accessibility that is there, that will be worked on and talked about more. And this idea of, liberate data responsibly, I think is most definitely, I'm looking at the comment here on how the privacy laws might intersect with ethical concerns. I know we're going to get to more of that discussion, but I just wanted to point out some of those things in terms of while we have to think about what our current practices are, I've been encouraging that as we think of our recommendations. I also want us to be careful that we are framing them in a way that the public understands what the procedures are and what the current laws are. So I think that's been there. The other last point I want to make before I hand it back over to you, Megan, is that this is a great comment about the staffing and the budget, and it should be kept in mind as we're thinking about recommendations moving forward. Is what would it take? And again, as an opportunity to brainstorm on how we move forward, and not necessarily as an opportunity to constrain our thinking. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Imelda. So up next, we had Lynn, who thank you for putting up with us it took us a little while to get to you, but Lynn, it's over to you.
Well, so actually, one of my comments was basically the same one Barry made, which was that users should face the same consequences for releasing private data as government employees do. When my mother worked for the IRS, she would have gone to jail if she had shared a tax return. Whereas anybody outside who got a tax return or revealed the information directly, and maybe I think there might be some rules on return preparers, but for others who just go in and try to hack the data and get information, there aren't any consequences. There are also some people inside government, I think including everybody in the congressional branch, who aren't affected by those limitations. So, at the same time that we try to come up with methods that are designed to really protect privacy, particularly if we're going to have tiered access and people are going to have, we're going to be trusting people to have some access to the data that they wouldn't make public, we need to have consequences if they violate that trust. The second thing, this is also related to the discussion that's already happened, is that this seems like an obvious point, but legislation should include research for evidence building as a priority. Right now, I mean, census and the IRS, census and the IRS both are doing what they're mandated to do. The IRS is supposed to use data to improve tax administration, census to improve the quality of the census. Research using those data should have just as high a priority, given the constraint that we do everything possible to protect privacy. Like, for example, there's a lot of interest now, and there's a presidential directive that says that we should try to find out about racial inequities in various policies, but it's not clear that there's any legal way for census and the IRS to match their data, so the IRS would actually know race and ethnicity on the tax data. That should be a priority.
Thank you so much. Up next, we'll go over to Christina.
Thanks, Megan. So I just wanted to follow up on Ken's point that he made about sort of the allowable uses for census data to improve mission for census or advance census's mission. I think obviously that it should still stand, but also, as we're thinking about these rules or processes or standards, it's important to also embrace the idea of burden reduction. And to me, it seems like, federal government has a collective public good to improve, improve standards for those that it's serving, and all of the federal agencies are supporting that effort. And it seems like, from those stakeholder perspective, it's important that this committee, I think, also reflects that there are these principles of, reducing that burden on them to continuously report the same exact data to different agencies when we're all in the same collective service. And I think as we're embracing this idea of the federal data as public good, that should be sort of a theme in the way and allowable uses of it is in terms of enhancing that public good.
Thank you so much. That's a great point. Absolutely. Up next, Julia, I saw you had a comment earlier, so we can go over to you.
Yeah, I would like to highlight Chris's comments on the role of the states and Anna's as well, which is the federal data are collected by the states and states administer federal programs, and different states have different levels of flexibility with testing out different privacy options. So I know some of the states in the Midwest Collaborative are experimenting with a tiered access approach. And essentially what they're doing there is having, obviously confidential microdata in a secure enclave, public use data that have gone through the standard disclosure review, but then a middle tier where they have confidential summary tabulations, where the summary tabulations have a certain number to a cell, but to Barry's point, the people who access it agree not to attempt to re-identify. So you combine both a technical approach and a legal approach to data use and access. So my point is that we have a laboratory of 50 different states that can test out different approaches and see how that affects the value. Those confidential summary tabs are going to the governor's office and the workforce boards to provide weekly information on unemployment claims at the local level so that they can make decisions right away about where to allocate resources. So a very clear use case in this current environment and a very clear value proposition for the tiered access approach.
Thank you so much, Julia. So there's a lot of great comments in the chat, and we are capturing everything. We do have to move on just so that we make sure we stay on our schedule, but we are capturing all of the comments and questions and concerns in the chat section. So Imelda, I'll turn it back over to you.
So I really want to thank Chris and Nick for giving us an absolutely awesome framework to have this discussion today. And I do see that there's at least one question that we probably covered somewhat, but not fully. So I look forward to future discussions on this. For now, we're going to have a report on our government data for evidence building from committee members Anna Hugh and Ken from the University of Kentucky. And I turn it over to you to present to us on government data for evidence building.
Great, thanks, Imelda. I think I'm going to take the lead since Anna has already done a little leading in this meeting already, so I volunteered, I offered to do that. So, but she of course feels free. I hope she feels free to jump in anytime she wants to add or correct anything I say. And so, how about we go to the next slide? And I guess we viewed our purview as thinking about ways to facilitate getting government data into some sort of facility or facilitate access to government data. And we, in our conversation, we sort of went back to the presentation that Anna and I had given to the whole committee to the meeting before our committee. So I guess it may have been the last meeting we had before prior to our subcommittee meeting. But so one thing we sort of started off the meeting with is sort of kind of what are the things we want to focus on? What are some of the scope of topics? And we had a long conversation, and I think sort of kind of came to some consensus around we want to start thinking about how data gets into the system and trying to help ensure that data gets into the system in as accurate and protected and efficient way possible. So start thinking about the data providers, and this gets right back to the point Julia was just making. A lot of the data is actually flowing from individuals who are participating in programs at the state level or the local level. And so think about the person providing their data. Think about the person collecting the data in a disaggregate setting, in a local or state or regional setting, and then think about how we can better facilitate all of that data flowing into a system such as the NSDS and into federal agencies, and use that as sort of one of the driving forces of how do we ensure that occurs in the best way possible to ensure that we have data, the best data possible that would allow us to do evidence building, the task that we're all about. And so evidence building at a variety of different levels. So start with that as a focus and kind of take a multi-pronged approach. How do you get the data in? Work with folks collecting the data to figure out how to build capacity by training people better who are collecting the data, making people aware, as have already been stated, at the local level of why they're collecting this data, the importance of what they're doing, how this is going to benefit a large number of people. Make sure they have the skills and capacity to make that transformation. You want to emphasize that the data providers are the starting point and what challenges are they facing. Again, back to this issue of I'll come back to that in a second. So also thinking about once data get into some system or wherever it is, and for lack of a better term, the NSDS, which is sort of kind of what I have in mind. How do you ensure that the people who are accessing this data understand those data? How do we make sure that the connections are there so that data are being utilized appropriately, that you understand, that people understand how the data, what we call the data generating process, how did this observation get in my data set? And what is it really telling me? What are the questions? What is the information that we think that data are, that we're collecting? So you need expert guidance, and we need to think about whether we build that expert guidance inside an NSDS. Do we have people in the NSDS, and probably also make sure that we have the connections with the agencies providing the data, so that the users of the data get the best advice, get the documentation done appropriately, all of course while ensuring that many of the federal agencies or the state agencies or the local agencies who are providing the data have a lot of other needs and goals and agendas that they have to serve, so to ensure that we can build those capacities with minimizing the impact on them. And I think about, we talked about, do we develop an educational component for the NSDS so that we're expanding the user base beyond just, PhDs, researchers? Get the NSDS, I think we talked a little bit about it, to discuss how people can use the data and the advantages of these data, and to get people, provide skills so that people can access these data, not just, again, researchers coming out of people with PhDs. We've already touched on the identify and recommend solutions for federal legislation and regulations that prevent data sharing, how can we do that better? And then identify the barriers. I think it would be nice, and maybe this is sort of, again, what the regulation committee is doing. Let's come up with a list of these barriers that are hindering government data sharing at all levels. We talked a lot about barriers at the federal level, and again, we've touched on the barriers at the state level. But maybe it would be nice to have a list of here are all the things that here are all the issues that one faces when one tries to do actually evidence-based policy research, and how can we overcome these barriers. Next slide, please. So we did come up with some potential quick wins, one of which is maybe we could start by getting a better coordination between the federal and state and local stakeholders revolving around interpretations of the regulations. What are the rules? Let's all agree on what the rules say. Can we come up with an agreement on what the rules say so that we have consistent understanding of what is and is not allowed? The Commission on Evidence-Based Policy, one of the recommendations was that for OMB to put out guidances when agencies are being too conservative. Not clear that's happened yet. Maybe that would be something we could recommend. And then maybe we could also come up with recommendations for where additional guidance is needed, and sort of make recommendations to federal, state, and local at the state and local levels about what's the best practices, what are the best ways to ensure that we're protecting the privacy of the data, increase access at the same time. So again, another potential quick win would be to start with some of the basic requirements of the Evidence Act, and then sort of connect these to some ongoing work at the state and local at the local levels. This examples and CHS is using privacy-preserving record linkages. So can we expand on that? Another one is to take some of the work that's going on that we know that is trying to span both the federal and state organizations to do some policy work. And the example we came up with that I threw out actually was Bruce Meyer is doing some phenomenal work on trying to improve poverty estimates by collecting all of the benefit data so that we can get measures not only of household income, but transfer payments. And so we can improve, we get a better understanding of where the gaps in the system really are, and where we're actually doing a pretty good job of improving, providing support to households. So there's an example, and it's clearly Bruce in his work, I know, has run into a lot of barriers in getting sort of, for example, SNAP data from states. And so how do we use this as a vehicle to try to improving this process? Next slide. So we'd like, I guess, some input on, we have discussed previously with trying to use the UI system as a pilot program to see whether we can improve the flow of data into the UI system, how that data flows up to the federal government and then supports a variety of research projects, not just wage record data, but benefits payments, both regular benefits, extended benefits, pandemic unemployment assistance benefits, and linking all of those data together. How do we get better systems at the state level? I am sitting in a state where the state had proposed that they were going to reform the UI system so that we could actually pay people the money that they got, since we didn't do a very good job of that. And the governor has abandoned those efforts, and they're going to start all over again to take the bidding process to bring a contractor in. So clearly that work needs to be done, certainly in Kentucky, and some of the conversation we've already had is about barriers existing to sharing data at all levels. What are some of those barriers? Again, we focused on the state. We've made some comments at the federal level. I'm going to stop there. Anna, do you want to add anything?
That's just a few things. You know, again, Ken, you did a really good overview and covered, I mean, again, the conversation was very broad-reaching, and a lot of good points already raised on that. But the whole idea is consistency, right? I think when the state and feds don't necessarily agree on the definition and the terms, and the understanding, unfortunately, isn't filtered down consistently through our team staff, so that when we are mandated to do certain things, and again, I think we've revisited the topic of how much our data reporting, at least from local and feds, local and states up to the feds, is very much driven towards compliance, right? What do we need to put in what box on what report? And that's how we've built at least our own systems and the data that it collects very much towards that aspect. So, you know, if we can better understand and, you know, the human element of that, especially with lawyers that are involved in holding us accountable to those compliance requirements and the privacy and confidentiality issues, I think having that level of consistent interpretation and guidance from OMB and the federal agencies is supremely helpful on the local and state level. Again, it helps us have something to go back to those, you know, legal advisors that we have to uphold to, because oftentimes that's kind of where, you know, as a decision maker, it may not necessarily be just the mission and the objective and the goal, but the lawyers have to check the box and make sure that we are all in compliance as well. And so that oftentimes can be a huge hurdle, even though we all may agree on the value proposition. The risk factor may be deemed to be too high to accomplish the value. I know that, you know, comments that we had during the conversation too is that there are some ongoing efforts which we are also see as real promising in terms of offering some guidance and help in that on the federal agency level, and in terms of particularly economic mobility, and our understanding that there is work on an economic mobility council between HHS, DOL, and USDA, and you know, at least HHS and DOL have held these joint regional sessions for the last few years on the topic of economic mobility. And a key part of that conversation, again, is consistent interpretation of where the bright lines are of where we cannot share data. I think everybody that goes to those meetings have a great emphasis and focus and desire to better serve the citizens who are involved in a number of those programs. But there's just no real ability for the consistency of sharing SNAP, UI, TANF data across the board sometimes, and that can be very challenging in serving those populations too, as just an example. But, you know, overall, Ken, good job, and I think, you know, the topics that we covered have also bled into topic areas that some of the other subcommittees have been working on as well. Especially, you know, just going back to the requirements, as Christina noted during the conversation that we talked about the vision. And so, you know, we know, at least on the state and local level, what our requirements are for reporting because of the compliance part, right? But that doesn't necessarily lead to the same value proposition. And then Chris's comments in terms of the legislation and regulation, just consistency of interpretation. What other way we can help support that and offer, again, state and local governments who oftentimes don't have additional resources to continue to interpret some of these things. So we just kind of go by default as the least risky interpretation, right? So anyway, those are my comments in addition to Ken's, and we welcome discussion and feedback from you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. So kind of to piggyback off of what you were saying, Matt, in your comment, you mentioned that expert guidance has come up as part of the capacity building group as well. Is there additional details or anything else you wanted to expand on that about some of the discussions that might have been happening there related to this topic?
Thanks. No, it was just raised as something we need to consider, so it's great to see that it's echoed here in this group as well. And like our previous items on comms, we'll be sure to add it to our agenda and get it back to the main group for further discussion.
Perfect. Perfect, thank you. And then just as a reminder, so when there are things that seem to be happening or seem to be falling within the scope of multiple of the subcommittees, we're working on tracking those items, as well as they'll be brought before the coordinating committee to make sure that there's common understanding of which pieces of those particular topics fall in which subcommittees. So to help come to a decision about which subcommittee may take point on certain issues, or if the issues can be broken down into individual pieces that then are parsed out to the different subcommittees, just so that we are helping to resolve some of those overlap areas. So Christina, we'll go to you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, Megan, if I could just follow up on that, I think that was a great reminder of what we want to do with what we're getting now in terms of which committee. I also just wanted to remind people of the spreadsheet. It might have been a little bit, seems like it's a little bit dense, but we have in there the CEP recommendations. So the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking had some recommendations that were not enacted under the Evidence Act, and they're almost all about data access. So I know there's been quite a bit of a conversation about different titles, so I just want to remind that there's some good information there for us to keep in our back pockets. The research was done, there were findings, and just to be aware that they exist as we move forward and think about answering the questions that we have posed to us today. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much, Imelda. So we'll go to Christina first. I see you have a comment.
Thanks, Megan. So obviously, my input coming from the Labor Department on using UI systems as a pilot program sounds excellent. But I would also add that another consideration that I think the UI system as a pilot program raises is in relationship to the public writ large as a stakeholder, because of the fact that if we're thinking about, which particular, for example, states decide to voluntarily partner in system improvements, that we would probably notice that there are a selection of states that continue to be interested in opening up their data, and then others that may not be. So I think that it's important to recognize that that we have to keep in mind the equity issues inherent to thinking about the various stakeholders perspectives that are important to bake into these pilots, because there is a strong value proposition to us as the federal committee thinking about the entire population and as individuals and making sure that there's transparency to their access and recipiency issues that I know is less transparent in some states.
Can I
Absolutely.
just
yes, please
respond to what? Yeah. So great comments, Christine. I think actually the fact that there are variations across states and their willingness to be transparent or not is one of the things that makes it an important pilot project. Because obviously, one of the things that we want to see is, what are these roadblocks? What are the things that we need to overcome? And part of the pilot project may be actually seeing whether we can overcome some of the reluctance on states to participate in this, because ultimately, that's going to be an issue that we face with any data that we try to get into a system, is reluctance on various entities in participating in it. And so demonstrating the value proposition is going to be important, and this seems like a great place to do it.
Thank you so much, Ken. That's definitely a great point. Right now, we do not have any other comments in the chat. Are there other comments, questions that folks wanted to bring up regarding the government data presentation? Oh, go ahead, Amy. I see you have a comment.
I started typing it and then it got really long, so I'll just try to say it. When Anna was talking, this comes back to working with USDA through census to reach out and try to get SNAP data. There is the objective of building evidence by using the data to produce statistical summaries. And I think that we in the committee may need to connect the dots between how that has a benefit to the program, because the USDA statute says that you can only use that SNAP data. You know, this goes back to what Ken was saying about Bruce's limitations in getting access to food stamps. If the people in the state that are collecting the data say, I can't share the data because I have the feds telling me I can only use it for program administration, and you're telling me you want to use it for evaluation, this goes back to, I think, the conversation with Nick's group, maybe, that you need these regs to clarify that statistical uses can have this sort of programmatic benefit, but making a clear distinction between statistics can help you better understand your program isn't the same as this is going to help you understand whose door to knock on. So that's really, I think, where we've got to have that line between what these aims are. And I'll let Nick take it from there because he's saying evaluation is program administration.
Yeah, this is a relatively new memo that came from OMB just a couple weeks ago, and I referenced it earlier, but I dropped it in the chat for the members. And this is it's 30 pages about evaluation and learning agendas and some of the Evidence Act requirements. So this is not my encouragement to everybody go read all 30 pages, but there are some gems in this memo that I think are really incredibly relevant for this committee, including normalizing the function of evaluation in government. It was one of the big components of the Evidence Act. And there's some just incredibly strong statements, maybe even some of the strongest we have ever seen about evaluation and its role in government from this memo. So, you know, if you have a couple minutes, scan the first couple pages and you'll get the gist. So
is that clear about how those things can be done for statistical purpose? Does it already connect those dots?
There's a lot that's connected in the details of the memo across the system. So the statistical officials, the evaluation officers, the chief data officers. Is it perfect? No, we're never going to have perfect guidance. But I think the OMB did a great job here connecting dots in ways that in the last 2 years, while we've been implementing the Evidence Act, we haven't had this level of connection. So again, not perfect, but it's a great starting point.
Thank you both so much, and thank you, Nick, for the link to the memo in the chat function. Julia, we'll go over to you with a comment.
Thanks. With the comment on evaluation program administration, I think directly tying to that, it's worth reiterating the importance of timeliness, because as Christina Chikeagu and Jordan Matsudera have pointed out, evaluation that is 4 years after a program is has been implemented is not particularly helpful. You kind of want to have the capacity to evaluate as new programs are being developed and administered to get early warning signals. So the notion of having
important because it's also important to look at long-term outcomes for some of the programs, which do take, the time horizon can be lengthy. So it's important that we sort of are baking in the capacity to do really quick, timely turnaround, and then also be able to look at the effects of sort of bigger investments over the longer term. But yeah, I agree. All of it is helpful.
And I should have called out Matt too, of course. Thank you.
Well, that's okay. I'll just harken back to our presentation we did with Chris back in the early days of the group, where we talked about this interplay between performance measurement for that kind of really critical formative information and then evaluation to talk about summative ends. And to Christina's point, let's look at fade out, right? Because especially in education, fade out or fade in is a real question. So yeah, plus one to all of your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are out of time for this particular session. If you did have a comment in the chat and we were not able to get it to you, we will certainly capture it in the notes. We're sending them to the subcommittee chairs as well. And if you would like to add additional comments onto your comment, to additional details onto your comment, please just feel free to send it to the support staff and we'll add it on. So Milda, I will toss it back to you.
So thank you so much. I want to thank Ken and Anna for their presentation and to the commenters for another productive discussion. Yes, and Nick, I wanted to thank you for pointing out that memo, and it specifies the role of the Chief Data Officer and the Chief Evaluation Officer and the statistical official for all those department level agencies. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we start to think about how do we work within this, what's been described and what we know to be a decentralized way of doing government. This is one area where we see key people involved in the data governance for their agencies. With that, I want to say we're going to take a 10-minute break. According to my clock, it's 11:06. When we return at 11:16, we will have a discussion on decision-making standards. Thank you and see you then. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you back from the break. These have been some really great discussions. I don't know about you, but this is what excited me about being on the committee, this kind of discussion that we're having today. Next, we're going to have committee members Lila Alakrosh from the City of Dallas and Matthew Sodner from the Department of Education, who will tee up the discussion on decision-making standards. Oops, did I get ahead of Ryan? There we are.
Sorry, my PowerPoint crashed.
It's a summer day, a Friday on a, so during the summer we can expect these things. Committee members, are you ready?
We are. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Imelda. Well, I'll echo your comments on how great the discussion has been today, and it, I think, puts into relief the reason why we have our next presentation, which is because at some point after all these wonderful comments, we're going to have to make some decisions about what we're going to recommend, both at the subcommittee and committee level. And so we're going to talk about that for just a few minutes. So, Ryan, if you can take us to the next slide. All right, so I think you heard today the range of kind of decisions that we may be facing as both a subcommittee and a whole group. So there's questions about technical architecture that will need to be resolved. There are questions about the range of services we might provide to our stakeholders across government and in the public. Questions about law and regulation and guidance, which came up a lot today. And then, of course, issues around technology, privacy protection, ensuring confidentiality. As Lila and I thought about this work and the challenge of decision making, really what came to the fore to us or for us is that we wanted to be sure that as we began to make decisions around recommendations, regardless of the level, that we want to be sure that we proposed a structure that was principle-based, transparent, and really importantly, gives equal voice to all participants. Melissa mentioned at the start of the call the real value of having the range of stakeholders that we do have on this call, but that value is only maximized when every single voice gets into the decision-making process. And so we're proposing something we hope brings everyone into the conversation, gives folks a common understanding of how it is we might come to make a decision around a recommendation, and really importantly is transparent so that folks who are watching us either right now or who might come behind us and want to know how on earth we came to something, that there's some rationale behind what we've done. So we do think this process is broadly applicable. Lila's going to lay out the mechanics of it in the next two slides. Just know that we think it probably also can be adjusted in terms of how in-depth you use this framework based upon the kind of level of import of the decision you're coming to make. But I'll turn it over to her to share a bit more.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. I appreciate the introduction. We have had such a wonderful, robust discussion this morning. We wanted to share more about the coordinating committee's discussion back at our last meeting in May. So if you can just advance to the next slide. Great. So generally, what we discussed in our meeting was when we consider a number of different options, each committee member will have the choice to rank their choices based on a set of criteria. And we wanted to create a process so it's as objective as possible and as inclusive as possible. So step one is that we will look at the criteria, agree upon the criteria, and then use the criteria to rank the possible solutions. And so at this coordinating committee level, we've identified a set of potential criteria that are overarching and could be applicable across all of the subcommittees. And you will be given an option at the subcommittee level to add on additional criteria that might be useful to the respective criteria. So if you're on a privacy committee or an infrastructure committee, there might be specific criteria that might be necessary to evaluate an option at that level. Step two, when a decision is made, all of the committees will have a robust discussion similar to the ones we've been having this morning about each option, and we'll have an opportunity to further pursue solutions relative to the criteria that's been identified. Step three, each committee member after the discussion will be able to individually rank their options based on the agreed upon criteria. We felt that having the option to evaluate independently versus just having a group discussion would be helpful, because in some settings, some members may not contribute as much to the robust discussion, but might feel much more robust and comfortable being able to rank independently once they've heard all of the discussions, and then having some time to go back and evaluate and consider what they believe to be the most appropriate option. And then step four is obviously the aggregation of all of the individual members' rankings, with the most favorable ones ranked up top. And in the case of a tie, we thought about the opportunity for the committee to go back to step two, perhaps reconsider only the tied options and go through the process again. Again, this is just a general model for how we can evaluate options. We welcome any feedback after the presentation about what additional steps or revisions might be necessary. Next slide, please. So here's some example criteria that the committee developed or discussed, and you'll see that a lot of the subcommittee or criteria here represent subcommittee topics. We wanted to make sure that the subcommittee's discussion, their evaluation, their feedback was really represented in the core broad areas of the criteria themselves. And so this is a set of potential criteria that we wanted to pose to the group for feedback. So the first criteria that we developed or thought about is one that should be no surprise to this committee. We've talked about this. That's come up consistently for every previous meeting and even this morning, the value proposition question. So to what extent does the option have the potential to lead to a solution given timeliness, which we've also spoken about this morning, and saliency for key stakeholders? And we believe setting that as the first criteria just underlines and reinforces the fact that the value proposition should be front and center for any option that we consider. The second criteria is technical feasibility. There's a whole dedicated subcommittee around this, but we really wanted to lift that up as a general criteria overall. And we wanted to consider to what extent is the option feasible given existing or planned technology. The third criteria we identified as a group was resource feasibility. Again, we talked about this morning as well, so we can see how a lot of these discussions are cross-cutting and branching out to multiple subcommittees. But in this specific criteria, what we identified was, the necessary resources, including people, time, and money that might be available to implement the option. And finally, criteria 4, which is around privacy and legal considerations. To what extent is the solution free of significant concerns related to personal privacy, law, and regulation? And again, there's been some discussion this morning about tiered access and how that might come into play as we continue these discussions on the journey to establishing an SDS. So like I mentioned before, ultimately we want to set a baseline of criteria at the coordinating committee level. We want to offer the opportunity for subcommittees to add on additional criteria as it's relevant to their work. But we wanted to make sure that overall us as a group, as a committee, has the opportunity to establish and agree upon a core set of criteria, and then have the subcommittees go back, and if they have relevant additional criteria, have the opportunity for those subcommittee members to add on those criteria for those groups. So with that, if we can advance to the next slide. We presented some discussion questions here to keep the feedback going. Again, the coordinating committee we know includes a subset of members, and so we wanted to bring this back to the group to get feedback from the larger team. And some of the questions are on the slide. we don't need to go through them one by one, but these are just some questions that we thought about as a committee that we wanted some further feedback on. So with that, I will pause and open it up for questions based on the presumptions we made at the beginning of the slide, the criteria itself, and just the process in which we evaluate options.
Thank you so much. So right now we do not have any questions or comments in the chat. So if folks have anything that they would like to add, any questions or any thoughts on what was presented, please feel free to note in the chat that you have a comment or a question.
So as people are thinking about comments and questions, which I'm sure they will have, I'll stretch for you guys as you're thinking. So operationally, what this would look like, I think, is that if a subcommittee came to the whole committee and said, "Hey, we've reached a decision we want to bring to you," anyone on the subcommittee could say, you know, what are the objective criteria you use to evaluate the options, and how did this stack up to the second best or whatever else? So this really is about people going into making a decision before it's made, knowing how it will be judged, and the rest of us at the kind of main committee level being able to ask questions of subcommittees as to how they came to their decision and have it be really clear. And all, you know, hopefully we all would agree that it's being done in an objective manner. And I think that gave enough time for at least Len to have a question.
You did. Thank you so much. So Len, we'll go over to you.
Hi. So I actually sent this message to Amy by accident. I'm not exactly sure why, but I guess, Amy, you just pop up first when I'm thinking about anything. The criteria obviously don't have equal weight. I mean, if something would represent a serious privacy concern, it really doesn't matter whether it be a huge value proposition. If something's not technically feasible, it might be really desirable, but again, it might that might negate the other things. On the other hand, something that's not technically feasible now might be feasible over the long run. If the agencies don't have the resources to administer something now, that also could change over time. One thing that concerns me about having a vote and then just saying, well, okay, we decided by a vote of 12-5 that this is the solution, is that people might have different levels of intensity of feeling, or they might want to talk to each other about why they reach different judgments. So what I would suggest is that I think the starting with voting would be fine, but then after the vote, you should have a discussion to see whether you can reach consensus or something like consensus, or at least make sure that if you've got different perspectives, that everyone understands what the different perspectives are.
Yeah, and I love the idea of the discussion. I guess what I'd say is we hope that the rating or ranking option might make it feel a little bit like a up or down, yes or no on a given choice, but reflects some of the level of intensity of difference between folks, but perhaps not. But yeah, I think at a minimum, we'd want there to be a chance for people to talk afterwards and debrief how the group came to the decision it did.
Great, thank you so much. Other comments or questions? Or feedback on anything that they were presented? Yes, Barry, we can go over to you.
So I think I'm going to agree with Len, especially the third and fourth comment. I mean, we've talked a great deal about how limited resources at the agencies and existing laws and regulations are the barriers that prevent us from realizing some of these goals or some of the goals of the original commission right now. And so taking them as the existing state as a criteria for voting doesn't seem to make sense to me. I mean, it seems to make sense to make sure you explicitly address those things in whatever recommendation we're going to make. If we're going to do A, then we need to make sure that there's this level of resources, and maybe we recommend these legal changes. But I don't think that they, in and of themselves, are a decision criteria.
Thank you so much. So Ted, I see you have a comment about the criteria not necessarily applying in the same way for each recommendation. So do you mind expanding a little bit on that?
Sure. I think this is a great starting point.
It's a little bit hard to hear you.
All right. Hopefully you can hear me better. Just shout. Okay. So I just was going to say, I think it's a great starting point and a good way to think about the decisions. As we're thinking strategically about the recommendations, there may be instances where there are proofs of concept where we want to test out technical feasibility or win hearts and minds by showing value through an innovative pilot project where some of the private legal considerations need to be addressed through those pilot projects, but in a limited and safe way. So I think it's good, just not on autopilot, obviously, whenever we're applying them.
Great, thank you so much. Julia, we'll go over to you for your comments.
Thank you so much. The one, I think it's a great framework as well. Where I might push back a little bit is I always think value and privacy need to be jointly determined. So having them as separate buckets rather than as interlocking buckets is maybe something that should be considered.
Okay, great. Absolutely. Thank you. And then Anna, I saw that you mentioned that for criteria 2 and 3, they're similar to the questions you raised in the RFP process. Was there anything you wanted to expand more on that particular comment?
Just in looking at a lot of the ideas and things, I think we've talked about, wanting to have flexibility in generating a lot of ideas and fostering kind of this sense of innovation, knowing that we may make some decisions now, but we want to be open to new ideas, new technology, the way that people are going to evolve, how they want to engage with us and communicate with us is going to be a key part of that too. And so, looking at criteria 2 and 3, those are all things that we kind of need to take into account, that there may be some issues, as noted, that do constrain us now, but maybe by putting the ideas out there, that we're able to kind of generate the sort of support and feasibility, for a future time. But also, I think too, I agree with Julia that at least in the data sharing opportunities that come to the state, oftentimes, again, I'm often the final signator on data sharing when it comes to us. And a lot of the conversation that we have with our lawyers, even when it's, state agency to state agency or even divisions within one state agency and sharing data, it is that value proposition and privacy and legal considerations that's the make or break sort of criteria for us. So is the risk too high, even though the value could be great too? So then, how do we, and so my kind of pushback to my team is when things like that come up is okay, so how can we lower the risk? Because we know the value exists out there, right? So if that is a challenge, is it a technology thing? Is it an education? Do we have certain safeguards? Do people, when they want to access and do certain things, do we make it really explicit to them and plain, language that if you share this data outside of X context, there will be legal consequences or other consequences, right? So it's that balance really of criteria 1 and 4 that, I tend to agree. You can't decouple that for us. And I think, technical resourcing, those are all just problems to solve for as well, right? Rather than thinking it's just one big pie and you have to divide it up certain ways. It's sort of how can we make more pies so that there's more resourcing and, and innovation is going to just continue to drive our technical feasibility as well.
Those are great points, and there's a lot of comments in the chat that are reiterating. Folks are agreeing with what you're saying, talking about how tiered access, Julia mentioned tiered access being a good balance, but then also a lot of folks who are agreeing with you on in terms of innovation and future feasibility of ambitious projects. So we will now go over to Chris, who has a comment.
Just a short one in regard to criteria 2 and 3, circling back to the vision that Nick et al. Were talking about first thing this morning. The basic requirements are necessary to use criteria 2 and 3 because it's technical feasibility to do what? Resource feasibility to do what? So we need the boundaries, the basic requirements in front of us to answer those 2 criteria. So that'll be a pretty essential feature of employing these. The other kind of just a general thought, we want to expand stakeholders, not just, value proposition to the existing, in with the in crowd who knows how to use and navigate our complex systems. So something like accessibility might be in here.
Absolutely, both great points. We'll now go over to Amy.
Hi, this was originally a reaction to what Julia was saying, and I agree with her about needing to have that coupling of value and privacy. But and then I think I'm going to end up just supporting everything that Anna said after Julia. There are going to be some projects that are going from nothing to something where you've never known the answer because you could never join the data to come up with the answer. And then you have some projects where you want them to go from something to something better. And there you might think that the value proposition and the privacy embedded in it is kind of a solved problem. But when you're saying, hey, you've been doing these data joins in the clear, or you've been delivering data on hard drives or on CDs or whatever the case may be, there are other methods that could make this safer, make this more efficient, make this something that is more scalable or could be done at a higher frequency. So I think that the thinking about whether something is going from nothing to something or something to maybe something better, I think that fits in with what Anna was saying. And I agree that keeping privacy tightly coupled to value is really critical, but sometimes getting people to think beyond what their current privacy solution is going to be necessary.
Absolutely great points. So we're going to stay on the topic of decision-making and of decision-making in general, but we're going to switch over to our second presentation on this topic from Imelda on the decision-making criteria. I'm sorry, on the decision-making matrix for the case studies.
Thank you, and thank you once again for a great conversation on decision-making standards. And one of the things I just want to keep in mind, and I so appreciated that there was a point out specifically to need for balance. We understand what constraints look like today, and we need to have those, practically speaking, we have to have those in our mind as we make decisions. We also recognize, as has been discussed today, that there is a need to innovate, and that we want to be making those recommendations so that we can provide some efficiencies and point out where we can be more effective. What I'd like to do for you today, the next slide, is to really talk with you about some cross-cutting themes when we think about our case study criteria. How are we going to identify where gaps may exist in either work that was done previously or work that's ongoing now or things that we're thinking about in the future. So as we're thinking about how to choose these case studies, I'm outlining a framework that conveys our three cross-cutting themes: demonstrating the value of a national secure data service, establishing a systematic approach toward privacy, and promoting incremental progress with balance, as we heard previously, with quick wins for near-term progress that build longer-term objections. So with this in mind, I'm going to talk about structure. When you're looking at the upcoming matrix, the rows indicate the major challenges to evidence-based decision-making, and the columns represent mechanisms for showing external validity by connecting to authoritative sources. So those sound like a lot of words, but basically it's saying what are those things that we need to be sure we're considering in the rows, and then what are the things going on outside, like executive orders and such going on the outside. And then the case studies, that matrix that you had gotten and we've been asking you to give us some input into, it includes the past, the present, and the proposed projects. Now, there are benefits for evaluating all three types of projects. For example, the past may provide us with lessons learned. Ongoing projects present opportunities to build on existing efforts, of which we know there are many, and future projects offer a platform for the committee to propose new targeted initiatives. Overall, this matrix approach to choosing case studies offers several benefits, including giving us a systematic way to learn from what's already done before we recommend something new. This ties nicely into the value proposition links that we've been talking about. There's an emphasis on stakeholder engagement and mapping out a path toward incremental progress. Next slide. So here's what this matrix could look like. We are looking for input from you. This is to get us started. So the challenge areas fall into 5 buckets. Policy. This is related to legislation, regulations, and guidance. A relevant case study should address questions like, what are the remaining legislative barriers to data access and sharing? How to address them? What additional guidance is needed from OMB? We've heard a lot about that today. Administrative. The barriers within administrative practices. Again, we've talked about it today. What statistical system practices could be improved to ensure that the systems work well together? How could standard operating procedures, common data sharing agreements, MOUs, and common consent forms improve access to and use of data for evidence building? Row 3, data governance and management. Those are challenges related to tiered access, metadata existence, data quality, transparency, and accountability. Now, a good case study would answer who would be, can be, an authorized user. What are the authorized uses? Started to hear a little bit of a discussion about that when around FSRDCs. And then how do we provide standardized metadata? What is the appropriate data quality framework? And there's a lot of work going on already in this space. Stakeholder engagement. This relates to difficulties with internal and external stakeholder needs. Statistical system coordination. I'm a little reassured that we've touched on most of these today, and capacity building. Key questions here include how to address the needs of government at all levels, both to facilitate the transfer of data into what we see our vision for, the NSDS, and to ensure the support system, that there's a support system for policymaking, evaluation, and monitoring. That was a question that I saw on one of the slides. Should we look at that separately for evaluation or not? How to address the privacy concerns of stakeholders and communicate protections appropriately. And then for number 5, this is technical issues. IT systems, production, R&D, and methodological capacity. Chosen case studies should address what are the relevant technologies and methods of data acquisition, linkage, and access. How to get data into NSDS and results out. How to protect data. How to build capacity for innovation. Now I'm going to move to the sources to show external validity, which include the administration's priority areas that support the main objectives of the current administration, including those outlined in the executive orders and memoranda on topics like restoring trust in government, equity, COVID-19, economic recovery, and climate change. The evidence-building implementation items that further the execution of the Evidence Act and the federal data strategy. And then we have the recommendations of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which are not included in the Evidence Act. I started talking about those a little bit earlier. Here we're looking to affirm, expand, and recast the Commission's recommendations as appropriate to meet the needs of the current evidence building ecosystem. Excuse me, next slide. Now let's walk through an example from the project inventory to see how the matrix could work. I also have to tell you, I want to walk through this example so we can start to get more input from you as well. So let's use the Data Toolkit. You may remember that the Data Protection Toolkit from the Federal Statistical System presentation. That's been a while back. That was our January committee meeting. The project is ongoing. It's still under development. And it is an effort of the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology that provides about 200 plus resources and tools for federal officials on disclosure, risk assessment, and mitigation, control data access, and governance. Again, I'm describing this just so that we can see this as an example for this matrix. Now, the primary purpose of the toolkit is to update and expand the statistical working paper. We like to give numbers to those. Some of you may like knowing those numbers, so that's working paper 22. It's a long-standing authoritative source of recommendations and guidelines for the selection and use of effective statistical disclosure limitation methods. Next slide. Now, let's see how the Data Protection Toolkit could address the evidence building challenges and tie into the broader outside priorities. So let's hone in on the data governance and management row of the matrix. Next slide. The toolkit is designed to help address restricted data governance challenges by providing an integrated repository of recommendations and guidelines for the selection and use of effective statistical disclosure methods and resources and tools to assist agencies. Now, when we look at the external validity columns, we'll see that this ties to the administrative's priority on restoring trust in government through scientific integrity and evidence-based policymaking, because it equips agencies to enhance public trust by applying proper access and proper protections and supports transparency by cataloging data protection strategies, policies, and charters. Then the toolkit also connects to the administration's priority on equity, as it heavily emphasizes the need for more granular data on all, well, I shouldn't say all, but on small populations, and highlights the role of data governance and management techniques, excuse me, around confidentiality and disclosure avoidance to meet that need. The toolkit also, and it supports the evidence building implementation items related to Title II of the Evidence Act, as it provides the governance tools to support program and departments to enhance their data inventories and make their data available and open as possible. What we haven't talked about much today, I started to bring this up earlier, has to do with Title III. Keep in mind that there's been a strengthening discussion in Title III update for SIPC. But anyway, we're talking about this case study right now. So this work for the Data Protection Toolkit connects to Title III of the Evidence Act because it draws parameters around the management of the tiered access that we've been discussing and includes an inventory of data access modes used by the federal agencies, including what we've heard about and known, such as those restricted use enclaves and the automated data tools. While I won't go through each row, you can see that the Data Protection Toolkit, it provides, ticks off the many boxes of the criteria matrix. And this is just one of the many examples of recent and ongoing work that the committee could evaluate and build on. By considering efforts already in the works, we'll be better equipped to identify gaps, as I mentioned before, and to propose future projects to fill them. Next slide. So what I see here is next steps, that we would gather feedback from you on the criteria matrix. We would refine it, and then we should begin to evaluate potential case studies. Excuse me. The project inventory provides many good examples to get the ball rolling, and we'll continue to add projects to this inventory going forward. In addition, some of the other tools the support team has compiled, keep those in mind, like the executive order summary and the crosswalk of the commission report recommendations to our focus areas could be extremely helpful here. So you might be wondering how this might work. Well, the focus area subcommittees can decide using those criteria that were discussed earlier about ideas that they're having, and then use this matrix to fill it out for potential case studies that you as a team or you as individuals believe would help us to meet some of our goals. As a first pass, you could focus on the big takeaways and identify one or two primary sales the project addresses. The entire matrix may be a bit much. And then you can fill out the other boxes as time allows. The coordinating committee will help facilitate among the focus areas, so co-chairs should feel free to reach out to them with questions about potential cases as needed. The full committee could evaluate the choices and affirm which ones to advance. And for decision making, the focus areas in the coordinating committee should use the agreed upon decision making standards like the ones Lila and Matt laid out for us. I am starting to feel like saying an iterative process is not a good word, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's not a good phrase. But like many other aspects of our work, I do expect this to be an iterative process with input coming from the focus area groups, the coordinating committee, and the full committee. The goal is to develop a list of featured case studies and suggested pilots with associated lessons learned, near-term action items, and longer-term objectives. And with that, Megan, I'd like to open it up for discussion. And
thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and please feel free to provide comments on both. I know we had a wealth of discussion on what was coming from before from Matt and Lila, but if there are other comments there, please let us hear that as well.
And so we have a question from Amy on whether it's up to each subcommittee to use or not use the matrix, and if so, if case studies are downvoted. If I'm assuming, or sorry, if you do not use the matrix, are case studies downvoted? Is that correct, Amy? Did I get it?
Yes.
Okay.
You can tell, Amy, I hadn't thought about downvoting case studies. And I'm not thinking so quickly on my feet about that.
Let's say that there are a bunch of case studies, and if some of the subcommittees have more complex or more novel case studies, they might not be as easy to fit into the columns, because the columns really cater to projects that are part of the federal ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. I know that you can fit almost any. I guess I have two comments. One, it seems that very feds for the feds. And two, if it's a creative writing assignment, I can make anything fit in there. So is this just an artifact that we're being forced to create? And if we choose not to create it, or are case studies not going to be prioritized?
There was quite a bit in there. So first of all, I want to go back to the original comment I made that this is a suggested framework. And so if you can think of other columns that would be appropriate, please suggest them. There's not a limitation there. And what I think you just did was to identify Oh my gosh. Oh, well. What you've done is identify a potential gap. And yeah, I don't want it to be bigger, and you might say, look, let's make it smaller. But what I would like us to have is some transparency around. So I'll tell you what maybe let's focus a little bit on the objective, which is to have some transparency around how are we thinking about the use cases of the past, the present, and what we might be recommending for the future because we've identified gaps. If you see these columns and rows not being conducive to objective, then please suggest others, not in an effort to expand, but in an effort to move us forward. I think also that, having said that, somebody has to probably narrow my focus down, I'll put it that way, just because I'm for innovation. The way you were describing it, something that's novel, not fitting here, would be a very huge negative from my point of view. So, keep that in mind. We're asking you to hear the presentation, see the matrix, and provide comments all at once, but everything doesn't have to be decided on today. We want to be able to provide a framework that makes sense for the committee. I don't know if that helped Amy or not, but I just really wanted to say I'm not trying to figure out a way to get things off the table that really ought to represent what the committee wants to recommend.
So Imelda, we have about 3 minutes left. We can continue to take another question, or if you want, we can ask folks to send any other comments or questions to the evidence@bea.gov mailbox, and then we can answer them offline and try to address them offline. What's your preference?
We do need to close out, but what I would suggest is that can we at least get one more question, just so that maybe it'll help people to think as they're mulling over what comments or suggestions or additions they want to provide. So the comments are, I think I'd like to hear at least one before we close out.
Absolutely. So we'll go to Chris then.
Hi, I think I'm using the term case study differently than the presenter. When I think of a case study, I think of a story of a particular a research project, right? A few weeks ago, maybe in one of our subcommittee meetings, Todd mentioned that he had just had a really tough time getting access to data for some research. And I would love a matrix that said, okay, how much time did it take to do the paperwork for the request? What were the initial questions you got back, and how long was it till you got them back? What issues did they raise? And then once they were raised, what action was necessary to resolve them? So I can pick apart what gets in our way over these case studies. And I'd like a similar case study associated with a state project where we're looking at state data. So we can get one level deeper in terms of the barriers, move from generalizations like a legal block or not enough staff to something more specific. What Imelda just described is something I think that would be useful in assessing some of the solutions we might come up with. But case study for me is literally a story about an incident and all the particulars that came up that inform the barriers. So just that comment.
Okay. So thank you so much for that comment. I did indicate we would take one. And it looks like we're going to have more discussion on this. Also, as you're thinking about this particular matrix that we've presented, it's very possible that what you might say is this looks great for the past and the present, but maybe we want to have something else for the future. Again, it's to provide a framework on how we might look going forward. I'm going to close that out and say to the team, let's be sure and follow back up on this discussion very soon. And then I just wanted to thank the subcommittees for the work that you've done so far. And I also want to thank you for scheduling your meetings to keep us moving forward. If you haven't already set those times, please do work with the support team to get that done. Please continue to provide the project inventories. For sure, those things that are in the past will fit this matrix. So please do continue to provide that feedback and to give us your comments so that we can move that forward. And then, unless you have major objections, like I said, if there's, maybe I didn't use the word egregious, but if you find this matrix egregious, then make those suggestions on how we can move it forward. But we definitely want us to have a framework, and we want to have one that embraces inclusiveness as well as innovation. So I want to be clear about that. Virtual site visits, and we're at noon, so let's see how fast can I get these points out. Virtual site visits as an extension of the information sharing process. We'd like to set up a few virtual field trips. So if you have a system or a project that you'd like to show off for us, please let us know. Please let the support team know so that we can start to get those scheduled. It's been really beneficial when we've had them. And you should know that the support team is starting to outline the year one report based on the committee's work plan and discussions to date. We'll be gathering feedback on report criteria and content in the coming weeks. So as I said, there are many things that are going on, and we want to be sure that we're advancing for report one. Normally, I would open up for final thoughts, but seeing how we're 1 minute past the hour, please be sure to share your final thoughts at evidence@bea.gov, and we'll be happy to hear from you. Thanks to all the presenters, all the commenters, the great attendance, and the great discussion that we had today. I look forward to seeing you on the 20th, and we'll hear then from the governance, technical infrastructure, and other services subcommittees, and we'll also discuss the year one report. And with that, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you so very much, and enjoy your weekend.